You know that feeling when the world feels like it's spinning a little too fast, and you're just trying to grab onto something solid, something that, well, gives things meaning.
Absolutely. Yeah. And Jordan Peterson, he's definitely become that solid ground for a lot of people looking for exactly that.
His ideas are, well, they're everywhere, aren't they? They've really become a huge part of the cultural conversation.
No doubt about it. A really significant part for a large audience.
And you can't help but notice just the sheer volume of stuff out there, books, lectures, videos, all about finding purpose. It's almost like this meaning industrial complex has popped up.
That's a really interesting way to put it.
And that's what we want to dive into today. This whole phenomenon and Peterson's pretty central role in it. Like, what kind of meaning is actually being offered here? And crucially, is it really helping people find their way?
Exactly. That's the core question for this deep dive. We want to really unpack the nature of that meaning he talks about. We'll explore the positive things people say, the changes they feel they've made because of his work. But we also need to look critically at the concerns people have raised.
Right. Does it genuinely guide people? Or are there maybe downsides, aspects that might actually get in the way?
Precisely. So we'll be looking at analyses of his actual work, critiques from various perspectives, and also just broader observations about, society today. What created the conditions for this meaning industrial complex to flourish?
Okay, let's start at the beginning then. Let's try to unpack his core message. It seems to boil down to life involves suffering inherently.
Yes, that's fundamental.
And meaning, for him, isn't about escaping that suffering. It's about choosing to take on responsibility despite it, voluntarily.
That's a very good summary. He argues that it's that willingness, accepting life's difficulties head on, not just chasing happiness, that ultimately gives you that deeper sense of purpose.
He talks nonstop about order and chaos, that dichotomy. How does that connect to finding meaning?
Oh, the order chaos thing is absolutely foundational to his whole worldview. He sees our existence as this constant balancing act between the two.
Okay,
Order, that's your structure, predictability, safety. It's the known territory.
right.
Chaos, well, that's the unexpected. It holds potential, but also danger, threat, the unknown.
So meaning comes from.
According to him, meaning isn't found by just hiding in order or letting yourself dissolve into chaos. It's about standing right there, on the border between them, and acting from that place, bravely.
So you're always sort of on the edge, on
Yeah.
this frontier.
Yeah.
But when you try to really pin down what Peterson means by meaning itself, it can feel a bit slippery, can't it? A little elusive.
That's a really sharp observation, and yeah, it's a major point of discussion. Sometimes it sounds almost mystical, doesn't it?
It does.
He uses phrases, things like atonement for the criminal fact of your fractured and damaged being, which suggests this really deep, personal, almost spiritual kind of experience.
It's atonement. Wow.
Yeah. It taps into that feeling lots of people have, that sense of being somehow flawed or broken. And meaning, in that sense, comes from acknowledging that and trying to, fix it through responsible action.
Right. So it's not like a simple checklist. And he talks about how meaning comes upon you, doesn't he? It's not something you just decide to have.
Exactly. It's portrayed more as something that emerges indirectly. It's a byproduct of living in a certain way, taking responsibility, telling the truth, facing things.
Okay. But then on the other hand, he also talks about meaning as this incredibly high bar, this huge monumental task of taking on as much responsibility as possible for individual life, society, and the world. That sounds, well, frankly, exhausting, almost impossible.
It's a definite contrast, isn't it? You've got this idea of meaning almost passively revealing itself, and then this incredibly demanding, almost heroic ideal of constant maximum responsibility.
Yeah.
And that ambiguity, that tension, that's something critics really focus on.
And underpinning a lot of this is his reliance on ancient wisdom, right? Old stories, myths, religion.
Yes, very much so. He draws heavily on biblical stories, on Jungian psychology,
Yeah.
arguing that these old narratives contain these timeless truths about being human, these fundamental archetypes that shape us.
But how credible are his interpretations within those fields? I mean, I've seen critiques saying he's a bit selective with the myths he uses.
That's a really important point. Critics, like the philosopher Paul Thagard, argue that his choice of myths often seems tailored to fit his existing ideas. And the whole idea of universal archetypes, the way Jung saw them, is still debated within psychology itself. So his readings aren't necessarily the standard view in those disciplines.
Okay. And then there's this idea of truth, which isn't always about, like, literal facts, is it? It's more about what works, what helps us survive.
Right. That pragmatic definition of truth. It further detaches his concept of meaning from, say, objective reality. If truth is just what's functional, then the meaning you get from it is less about shared facts and more about, well, adaptation, individual or societal.
So the meaning feels like it's built on something that could shift, depending on what seems needed at the time.
That's one interpretation. Yeah, it can feel that way.
So this vagueness, this lack of a single, clear definition of meaning, maybe it's not a bug, it's a feature. Is that the idea?
That's exactly the argument some analysts make about this whole meaning industrial complex. That very ambiguity allows meaning, the way Peterson presents it, to function as a kind of floating signifier.
Okay, what does that mean?
It means it can attach itself to all sorts of different anxieties and hopes. If you feel lost, meaning sounds like taking control. If you feel spiritual emptiness, it sounds like connecting to something bigger than yourself.
So it reflects back whatever the person's looking for.
Pretty much. It becomes a sort of mirror, which makes it incredibly attractive to a very wide range of people.
It makes sense. Everyone sees what they need to see.
Exactly. And this constant talk about order and chaos, sure, it's dramatic, but could it be maybe a bit too simple? Oversimplifying life?
Yeah. Is life really just that black and white?
Well, some critics argue it is a rather stark, maybe simplistic way to frame things. Life's usually more complex, more nuanced than just that binary, right? And always focusing on navigating that border, that constant struggle. It might keep you in a state of perpetual striving, always managing the tension instead of finding some kind of resolution or peace.
So you're always on edge, always needing to adjust.
You could say that. It keeps the journey itself and the need for guidance on that journey front and center. The problem never quite feels solved.
Okay, so we're starting to get a clearer picture of this idea of meaning in Peterson's work. Now, how does he actually sell this? How has he become so incredibly effective at reaching so many people? What are his strategies?
Well, his communication skills are undeniable. He uses a really powerful mix of rhetorical techniques. If you think about it in terms of Aristotle's classic appeals, ethos, pathos, logos, Peterson masters all three.
Okay, let's break that down. Ethos first is credibility as authority.
Right. He leans heavily on his academic background, the doctor title, professor emeritus, his past links with Harvard.
Yeah, you hear that mentioned a lot.
And it's not just background info. It functions almost like a shield. It frames him as an expert, so disagreeing with him can feel like you're questioning established knowledge. He also chooses his words very carefully, projects this image of intellectual seriousness, someone telling difficult truths.
Framing himself as the guy willing to say the unpopular thing.
Exactly. And that builds authority.
Okay. What about pathos, the emotional side?
Oh, hugely important. He connects directly with those feelings of anxiety, alienation, lack of direction that are so common today. He validates people's struggle.
Makes them feel understood.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he's not afraid to show his own emotions. You know, the interviews where he tears up. That creates empathy, makes him seem human, like someone who genuinely gets it. That emotional connection is vital for building that loyal following.
Definitely. Okay. And logos, the logic, the reasoning.
He presents his advice as logical, rational solutions. You know, the subtitle of his big book, An Antidote to Chaos. But the logic itself is this unique blend. Critics might call it a mix of sort of pseudo-biological arguments, bits of evolutionary psychology, some traditional values, often presented with appeals to common sense. And he uses very polite, measured language, which can make even quite controversial ideas sound more reasonable.
So it's this mix, authority, emotion, and this appearance of logic. That creates what you called a hermeneutic halo.
Exactly. It's like this aura of significance around everything he says. Even vague statements can seem profound. It makes people less likely to scrutinize things too closely. His words just feel important.
And a big part of his appeal seems to be how he handles religion and spirituality. It's often quite ambiguous, isn't it?
Yes, that spiritual vagueness is incredibly effective as a tool to widen his reach. He talks about the Bible a lot, but often frames it more as like a foundational text of Western culture, a source of archetypes, rather than strictly religious doctrine.
Right. Not necessarily literal truth, but deep truth.
Sort of. And his idea of God is also very fluid. It can mean conscience or cosmic order or a kind of psychological prop. It shifts depending on the context.
And he's quite cagey about his own personal belief, isn't he?
He often is, yeah. When asked directly if he believes in God, his answers tend to be indirect. He might talk about the pragmatic necessity of the idea or the psychological reality of it,
So he avoids drawing firm lines.
which allows people from all sorts of backgrounds, religious, agnostic, atheist, to find something in his message that resonates. It casts a very, very wide net.
Something for everyone, almost. And you also mentioned emotional ambiguity.
Yeah.
How does that work as persuasion?
Right. He often makes statements that just feel true on an intuitive level. They give you that little aha moment, that dopamine hit of insight.
Like a sugar rush, you call it.
Exactly. But they often lack clear definition or solid evidence, so you get this temporary feeling of understanding, this emotional satisfaction, without necessarily gaining real clarity or certainty. It feels good, but it might not be that substantial in the long run.
You get the feeling without maybe the hard intellectual work.
There's a lot to look at it, yeah.
Okay, so Peterson's pushing this strong message. Take individual responsibility. Pursue meaning. But there seems to be this potential twist, this paradox, where maybe, despite all the calls to act, it could actually discourage certain kinds of action, especially on bigger societal problems.
That's a really crucial point, yeah. A potential unintended consequence. While the message is definitely action-oriented for the individual, the way it's framed might unintentionally dampen enthusiasm for tackling systemic issues.
How so? I mean, he's constantly telling people, clean your room, take charge of your life.
He is, but the overwhelming emphasis is almost always on inner transformation first. The message is basically, sort yourself out before you dare criticize the world. Remember that famous line, if you cannot bring peace to your household, how dare you try to rule a city?
Yeah, I've definitely heard that one.
And look, there's obvious wisdom and personal responsibility. But critics like Matt McManus argue this intense focus can really downplay or even ignore the huge role that political and economic systems play in causing suffering.
Right. It's not always just about the individual's choices.
Exactly. Peterson often advises against blaming external factors. Don't blame capitalism, don't blame the radical left, whatever it is, until your own house is in perfect order.
Which could take forever.
Potentially. So the focus stays locked on the individual as the main agent of change.
And the effect of that is?
It can depoliticize suffering. If problems are seen mainly as individual failings, then the need for collective action for challenging systemic injustice feels less urgent. The focus shifts to personal resilience, self-improvement, which incidentally aligns quite neatly with a sort of neoliberal outlook.
Right. It lets the larger systems off the hook, in a way.
It can definitely have that effect. And what about the kind of meaning he promotes? We talked about how abstract it can be, how demanding. How does that affect someone's ability to actually do something?
Yeah, if meaning is this huge mystical thing or this almost impossibly high ideal, it could feel pretty overwhelming, couldn't it? Like, where do you even start?
Precisely. The sheer abstractness can be paralyzing for some. Even with all the calls to action, if the ultimate goal is so vague or so massive, people might really struggle to turn it into concrete steps they can take day to day. Someone like Peter Michelson talks about this risk of inner passivity. Basically, just telling people act might not be enough if they're facing deep psychological blocks or just don't have a clear sense of what to do.
It's like telling someone who's depressed to just cheer up.
That's a really good analogy. And even rules that sound simple, like tell the truth. Well, what does that actually mean in every complex situation? That lack of clear, practical guidance can lead to inaction. People might freeze up out of uncertainty or fear they can't possibly live up to the ideal.
And the constant focus on your own flaws, your own shortcomings, could that create a kind of negative spiral?
Absolutely. If meaning is this super high standard and the message is always look inward, fix yourself, then every time you feel you fall short, it could just lead to more self-criticism.
More guilt, maybe.
More guilt, more shame, and potentially a greater dependence on external guidance, maybe from Peterson, maybe from other figures in this meaning industrial complex. It could create a cycle of constantly seeking answers outside yourself rather than building your own autonomous sense of meaning.
Which brings us to suffering itself. It's so central to everything Peterson says. Life is suffering. That's like rule number one, almost. But is there a risk that this focus kind of morphs into something else?
There's definitely a risk, yeah. I mean, acknowledging suffering is part of many philosophies, many religions. But Peterson's intense emphasis on it, sometimes it can feel like it drifts into almost romanticizing hardship.
How so?
It's presented not just as inevitable, but almost as this necessary fire, this crucible you need to go through to build character and find meaning.
Suffering is the ultimate badge of honor, maybe.
Something like that. and the constant call to shoulder the burden of being. For some people, that could turn into a kind of performance. If meaning comes from how you handle suffering, then showing everyone how you're handling it, how much you're enduring, that can become part of your identity, almost like branding yourself through resilience.
Like you're racking up meeting points based on how hard things are.
In a sense, yeah. And when people start describing their own struggles using Peterson's language, the hero's journey, fighting their dragons, it becomes an exercise in identity construction. You're not just struggling, you're on this grand, meaningful quest.
Then could that lead to a sort of a hierarchy of suffering, where some kinds of pain get valued more than others?
That's a real concern. Does the big existential angst that fits the hero narrative get prioritized over, say, the grinding everyday suffering caused by poverty or discrimination?
Those might just get dismissed as, lack of individual effort?
Potentially. They might be seen implicitly as less meaningful forms of suffering, or as things the individual just needs to overcome through sheer will.
So again, the focus shifts away from the systemic causes.
Exactly. By framing suffering primarily as this individual internal journey towards meaning, its power as a potential catalyst for social critique, for collective action, often gets sidelined. It becomes about personal endurance, not systemic change.
Okay, so we've gone through all this. People engage with Peterson's ideas, read the books, watch the lectures. What's the end result? Does it actually help people who are searching for meaning? Or could it, like we wondered at the start, end up leaving the truly lost even more alone?
Well, first, we absolutely have to acknowledge the positive stories. Many people report really significant benefits, finding a sense of purpose they lacked, overcoming despair, taking practical steps to improve their lives. Those experiences are real and important.
Absolutely. You hear those testimonies all the time. People genuinely feel he's helped them turn things around.
Definitely. But there are also serious concerns about potential negative effects.
Yeah.
We talked about the vagueness that can just lead to confusion for some people. For those already dealing with depression or anxiety, that constant drumbeat of life is suffering could actually make things worse. Some sources describe it as potentially toxic and unhealthy.
Mm-hmm.
There are reports of people feeling intense guilt or shame because they can't meet these incredibly high ideals, whether it's about having children, achieving conventional success, whatever. And that relentless focus on individual responsibility. Well, if you're suffering because of systemic issues like discrimination or economic hardship, it
Yeah.
can leave you feeling blamed and totally isolated.
As if it's all your fault you can't find meaning within his specific framework.
Exactly. And then there are wider concerns, like the misuse of psychological theories, maybe Jungian ideas, to back up potentially regressive views on things like gender roles. Even professional bodies have raised concerns.
But I remember reading about findings regarding public statements deemed unprofessional or carrying risk.
Yes, the ICRC in Ontario, for example. Those are serious points. So if the meaning being offered is maybe more like that temporary sugar rush we talked about because it's built on ambiguity, then the underlying meaning crisis people feel isn't really being solved.
It just papers over the cracks for a while.
It might. And if people struggle to really grasp or apply his complex, sometimes dense ideas, I mean, some critics call his writing gobbledygook dressed up in pseudo-profundity,
Oh.
then if failing to get it could just deepen those feelings of inadequacy, make them feel even more lost than before.
And it might foster this ongoing need to keep consuming, keep searching within that same system.
It could, yeah. This whole meaning industrial complex, by its nature, kind of needs people to keep searching. It can create a reliance on constantly seeking the next insight, the next rule, maybe diverting energy away from building meaning autonomously, or from working together with others on shared problems.
Okay, so let's try to wrap up this deep dive. We've looked at this whole meaning industrial complex with Jordan Peterson as a major figure. We've talked about the ambiguity of the meaning he offers, his very effective communication style, that paradox where individual focus might hinder systemic action.
The way suffering itself can become part of the brand, and the really mixed bag of outcomes people report, both positive and potentially quite negative psychologically.
And coming back to that initial question, does this whole complex risk leaving the truly lost even more alone? Well, based on our discussion, it seems like that's a definite risk, isn't it?
It certainly seems possible, relying so heavily on abstract ideals, on individual responsibility, without maybe enough focus on systemic realities or clear, practical paths forward. Yeah, it could unfortunately deepen feelings of isolation and inadequacy for some.
Okay. So here's a final thought for you, we the listener, to maybe chew on. Should finding meaning be mostly an inside job, an individual quest? Or is it something that fundamentally needs community, needs collective effort to tackle the big systemic things we all face? Where do you find meaning? What frameworks actually help you make sense of it all? That's definitely something worth thinking about.